Here we go. Welcome to the Pearson Center's Change Conference. This is the third day of our conference. My name is Andrew Cardozo, and I'm president of the Pearson Center. Today, we'll be talking about broadcasting. As you may know, the Pearson Center is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging social and economic issues of the day. This conference builds on the last year's work when we addressed COVID and beyond through 40 webinars attended by 8,000 people. Over these 3 weeks, our conference will consist of 12 webinars. We are proud to say that this is the only think tank conference that includes representatives from all federal political parties, top business and labor leaders, and many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together to come up with good public policy recommendations. The focus of the conference is simple. With everything around us changing so fast, how do we plan for the long term? And what are the basic values and principles that we have to keep in mind? I want to take a moment to recognize that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and our speakers and audience come from traditional indigenous lands across Turtle Island. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors who supported this conference. The platinum sponsor is Bruce Power, the gold sponsors are CN and the Hill Times, and a special thank you to our sustaining sponsors who are Canada's Building Trades Unions and the International Association of Firefighters. While these webinars are free to attend, please feel free to visit our website, thepearsoncenter.ca, and make a contribution. Now, the topic of this webinar is Bill C-10, focusing on broadcasting in the decade ahead. This is the first updating of the Broadcasting Act in 30 years. And we have a stellar panel with us to discuss the bill ahead before Parliament. Starting with Scott Sims, who's a member of Parliament for Costa Bay Central Notre Dame in Newfoundland. It is such a large riding that you could take the Greater Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, put them all into his riding, and there'd still be land left over. He is the chair of the effective chair of the Effective Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. He will be joined by fellow panelists. Monica Ilay is CEO of the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. Howard Law is director of the Unifor Media Sector. Kevin Desjardins is president of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, who will be joining us. He's not on screen yet. Madeleine Ziniak is chair of the Canadian Ethnic Media Association and was formerly national vice president of Rogers Omni Television. And Alain Strati is assistant general counsel, regulatory affairs at Bell Media, Inc. Now, the format is as follows. Following a discussion for about 45 minutes, we will take questions from the audience. So to you, the audience, I say, please use the question box and we will get to those answers get to those questions and answers in about 45 minutes. We have an hour, so we will go till about 5 after 1. Let me start then with my questions. And the first question is to you, Scott, as a member of the government and chair of the committee. The Act, as I said, was last updated 30 years ago. A lot has changed since then. Can you give us a quick rundown on what the government is trying to achieve here and what the highlights of this bill are? The bill is primarily dealing with a number of amendments to the current Broadcasting Act. So Scott, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I want to thank the Pearson Center for doing this and your interest in this. And my fellow panelists, I want to thank you as well. Many of you I've already seen through testimony at committee. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can, because as you say, Andrew, it's been 30 years and we now have a bill which makes some substantial amendments to the Broadcasting Act after talking about it ad nauseum. Before I get into that though, I am currently in central Newfoundland, the unceded territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. So Budget 27 said that they wanted to do something serious about how we want to deal with the digital age and cultural diversity. So the cabinet issued orders to the CRTC into September 22nd to produce a report on new distribution models for broadcasting. So you see how this evolved as we're now getting into, at that point, streaming had already begun its ascent. In 2018, the CRTC released its report entitled Harnessing Change. The report recommends all players benefiting from operations in Canada also contribute to production of Canadian content. June 5th, the government launches the Broadcast and Telecommunications Legislative Review, which, as many of you would know on this call, we normally would call the Yale Report. So the mandate letters for Minister of Canadian Heritage, Minister of Industry, Science and Innovation contain commitments to modernize the Broadcasting Act, which now brings us up to January 19th. That's when the Yale Report was released. You'll see some of the remnants of the Yale Report throughout some of these major amendments to the Broadcasting Act. And of course, finally on November 3rd, we come and see C10, proposed legislation to update the Broadcasting Act. I'll try to do this brief as I can, but I just want to touch on 5 major things that the Act is trying to do here. And this encapsulates 5, 6, more than 10 years of conversation. Number 1, confirming that online broadcasting is covered under the Act. So currently, as many of you know, online undertakings that deliver audio and audio-visual content over the internet are exempt. This is the new terminology now, the online undertakings, which formerly was called, if you remember, over-the-top broadcasters, OTT. These are over-the-top. These are the Netflixes, Disneys, and so on and so forth. The bill provides the CRTC with new powers to regulate online audio and audio-visual services, allowing the CRTC to create conditions of service and other requirements. Some slight changes there. It also updates the CRTC's regulatory powers as they relate to traditional broadcasters. The bill ensures that the Act would not apply to users of social media services or social media services themselves for content posted by their users, which now has become somewhat contentious through the hearings, but I'll let my panelists weigh in on that in just a few moments. The bill ensures that online broadcasters will be regulated. When doing so, they would contribute in a material manner to the objectives of the Act. It will be up to the CRTC to determine which services will be regulated. That's one of the major thrusts of this. Number 2, updating the broadcasting and regulatory policies for Canada. Canadian broadcasting system should, through its programming and the employment opportunities arising out of its operations, to serve the needs and interests of all Canadians. Francophones, Anglophones, Indigenous, Canadians from racialized communities, and Canadians of diverse ethnocultural backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, abilities and disabilities, sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, and ages. And of course, one of the major components of this would be the bill underscores that programming reflect Indigenous cultures. Number 3, create a more flexible approach to regulation and sustainable funding for Canadian stories. So the bill will facilitate a flexible approach to regulation, which will allow the CRTC to tailor the conditions of service by considering the Act's policy and regulatory objectives, determining what is fair and equitable depending on the circumstances. As you can see, built in all this, there are a lot of instructions here that will be going out to the CRTC. And that being said, the 4th one, modernizing CRTC's enforcement powers. This is something that's been talked about for a long time. The bill provides the CRTC with new enforcement powers through an Administrative Monetary Policy Scheme, or AMPs. That's going to align the CRTC's enforcement powers and how it regulates telecommunications. The objective of these AMPs would be to promote compliance and not to punish. So there are some substantial changes there to bring these policies together. And 5, updating oversight and information sharing provisions. The bill ensures that the CRTC has the tools it needs as a modern regulator so that it may gather information from stakeholders and liaise with other departments and agencies. It also ensures that commercially sensitive information collected by the CRTC is protected. Those are, of course, there's a lot in there that I'm missing. But those are the 5 main points. I think the panelists that you see with me here are more qualified to get into more detail about it. So Andrew, just a quick update where we are right now. It is currently in committee, and we are dealing with it, but I guess I'll talk more about that at the end.
Okay, and so when you say it's in committee, just for people who aren't familiar with the process of Parliament, a bill is introduced, you said back in November. It's had 2 readings, goes to committee. You folks hear the Canadian Heritage Committee hears from Canadians. You make some recommendations, some changes, and it goes back to the House of Commons for them to pass it. Is that right?
Yeah, just the way from a legislative perspective, this is how it works, and this is something we inherited from the Westminster system. So first reading is tabling it. You can now see the bill. It's been tabled. It's public. You can see what's in it from front to back. The second reading is when we do several hours of debate. And once the debate collapses, and there was a motion by the Conservatives actually to put it into committee, we voted and it passed the House. Here's the thing that you have that's very important here. When second reading takes place and the House votes to accept it and send it to committee, if it's defeated, it just ends. That's it. If it's accepted, it goes to committee. But what you're doing here, what's very important, is that you're accepting the principles and the scope of the bill. The exercise we're doing this week at committee is the legislative clerks and myself, we're getting together to look at all the amendments being proposed by the members on the committee. And these amendments come from the 4 parties represented, and it could come from the Green Party as well, or independents. They have the right to introduce and debate amendments. They can't vote on them, but they have the right to introduce and debate. So my job this week would to find out if these amendments are within, if something is proposed, an amendment is proposed that goes outside the principle and scope of the bill, then I would have to make the ruling that it is not within, and it can't be voted on or can't be debated, because we've already said yes to the bill in principle. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but that's where we are with it right now. As chair, we're this through. Once we get through committee, then it goes back to the House for third reading. Reports.
Yeah, and just one more point to make is because we have a minority parliament, a majority of the MPs need to pass each amendment at committee stage. It's not enough of just the government to be supporting a change.
Correct.
And then once all that happens in the House, it gets repeated in the Senate, and it's worth mentioning that because the Senate is now a much more independent legislature and may take its time to go over this whole process in detail. So if the nod is a more or less agreement, I'll keep moving.
Keep in mind that the Senate will go through the committee process as well too.
That's right. Yeah.
Could be a while.
Yeah. Alain, let me start with you. What do you think are the highlights of the bill that you agree with? And I'll just do a quick round of everybody on that question.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks again for inviting me on the panel and to talk about the importance of Bill C-10. I think for us at Bell, and I think for broadcasts in general, it's really the principle and the first issue that was just mentioned. It's really that online broadcasting is covered and that there is contribution. And a couple of words there that are mentioned are important. Words like flexibility, contribution, and I'd also, I think that the regulatory system we have is adaptable, so it can also include online contributions. So it's interesting we use the phrase "over the top." It sort of has a barbarians at the gate sort of as a misnomer to it, because these days it's not over the top. I mean, there is no over and there is no top. It's been sort of like that wall has fallen. So if you take that image, it's really the fact that now there is an opportunity for contributions to be made by all broadcasters and all undertakings, online or not. And the question then becomes for the CRTC to look at what are the appropriate contributions and the flexibility for each of these various undertakings to make strong contributions to Canadian programming and Canadian media, and ultimately for content that is of interest and reflects the needs and demands of Canadians. So I think that's what we like the most in a nutshell, is the fact that it is addressing this fundamental and core issue. And that's sort of what we like, frankly, and agree with Bill C-10.
Okay, thank you. Monica Ile, your thoughts about what's best about the bill.
My name is Monica Abenaki from the community of Odanak, and I'd like to acknowledge I'm speaking from Jojagi, Montreal, the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka and land of gathering of many nations. So definitely APTN supports many amendments supports Bill C-10 on many fronts. First of all, the better reflection of Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous ownership, so Indigenous people could own their own media, and Indigenous languages at the same level as French and English. So definitely for me, that's a step towards appreciation, towards reconciliation. So for us, this is very important. We've been in the media industry for many years. When I'm talking about we, not only APTN, there are many Indigenous-owned media across Canada that are often underestimated. So by having this recognition, it just brings us the same playing field as others. And this is something definitely important to us. So in a nutshell, we support all of that.
Great, thank you. Howard Law, your perspectives on what you like about the bill.
Well, it's welcome that we're going to do what we've been asking for the last 10 years, which is to bring the foreign streamers into the system. You know, I think people started talking about repealing the digital media exemption order at least 10 years ago. And so, you know, we're making up for lost time here, but it's, you know, and we've been talking about this in earnest since 2017, but it looks like we're actually going to do something here. So it's a very positive step. And, you know, I'm hoping that as the bill moves through clause by clause, that, you know, in spite of the fact that it's, you know, we're in a minority parliament situation, you know, we've got a very effective chair. I'll say that without any sense of trying to butter up Scott. He's done a wonderful job. And I hope that encourages all the MPs on the committee to just be very businesslike and task oriented about getting this done. So bringing the foreign streamers into the system is going to bring presumably more contributions overall. There's been a lot of discussion about what that might be. And it's going to be ultimately up to either Parliament, Cabinet, and or the CRTC to make sure that the contributions go towards Canadian content, towards Canadian news, sports, and entertainment in a way that really preserves our values and reaches the audiences that are distinctly Canadian.
Okay, thank you. Madeline Ziniak, your thoughts?
Здравствуйте, очень хорошо вас всех видеть. And I think the fact that it's been 30 years since the Broadcasting Act, that was Belarusian Russian, by the way, which will hit my point home that certainly in Ontario and in Canada, we have languages spoken, over 180 languages spoken. And I think the Act is a wonderful opportunity to engage and harness full participation of Canadians. We know that Canada is one of the most multicultural countries globally, where 1 in 5 people are actually immigrants, which also speaks to the point that every 5th person speaks a language other than English or French. And I think this is an opportunity to harness full participation in the broadcasting system. So certainly the ethnocultural communities across Canada welcome this opportunity to have input in order to move the dial for equitable participation for all. And to that end, we have formed the Canadian Ethnocultural Coalition for Media, and that includes Canadian Ethnic Media Association, TLN Media, as well as the Canadian Cultural Council, as well as Ethnic Channels Group. So it is time for change. And looking at the fact that immigration is projected to be over 1 million in the upcoming year and years, this is really a time to be able to infuse into the Broadcast Act an opportunity for all Canadians from racialized communities, diverse ethnocultural backgrounds, to be able to produce programming in diverse languages, and also to have a system that supports ethnocultural communities in Canada. And to really, it's an opportunity to remove a lot of the historic systemic barriers.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, your thoughts?
To echo some of what was said already, I think that for us it was really the acknowledgement of the fundamental changes in the broadcasting industry over the past decade. I mean, it has been 30 years since the Broadcast Act has been amended, but certainly over the last decade, It's been 10 years since Netflix launched in Canada, and at this point, we're looking at about 50% of viewership in Canada now is, or 50% of Canadians are viewing through over-the-top services. And so, I think a proper acknowledgement of what those services, what their position in the Canadian broadcasting system is, and I think getting towards a recognition that, as we share the audience with these streaming services, that I think some of the obligations that have been imposed on broadcasters over the past 30 years need to start to be shared as well. The origins of much of the foundation of our legislative and regulatory framework was around this idea of the scarcity of access to the airwaves, and now these ideas of the scarcity of accessing Canadians, even notions like the diversity of voices in terms of the broadcasters that are out there. It's clearly something that needs to be addressed in C10. I think we're happy that it's taking those first steps towards addressing it.
Okay, thank you. Now, Kevin, we had some technical difficulties getting you on in time, so we weren't able to do a sound check. So I just want to pick on you for a moment. There's a bit of a clanking sound coming from somebody. It may be you. I'm only picking on you because we didn't do the sound check with you earlier. So if you can just keep tabs if there is something near your microphone, or otherwise mute yourself from time to time. But I'd say that to everybody, if you can mute yourself from time to time. With this number of people, there's often a bit of feedback. Let me move to what you'd like to see in terms of changes to the Act. Monica, I'll start with you. What would you like to see in terms of changes to Bill C10?
Certainly. Well, there's one clause that for us is problematic, and if I go into the details of this clause, is 310. And in this clause, they talk about programming that reflects the Indigenous culture of Canada, and programming that is in Indigenous languages should be provided within the Canadian broadcasting system. Now, that's wonderful. We all agree with that. Including by programming undertakings that are carried on by Indigenous persons. And we have an issue with that because when you talk about programming undertaking, that excludes online. So it feels like we're excluding Indigenous ownership on online. So we hope that that's just, a mistake, and that could be changed to broadcasting undertaking, because we know the ship is going to online. So Indigenous people, we should have the opportunity to be able to, carry online broadcasting. Now, there's also, we find a humongous hole in Bill C10. Now, Bill C10 would remove the CRTC's ability to oversee and support support distribution of Canadian programming services, such as APTN, in an online environment. So it's a concern to us, as we know that everything's shifting online. APTN's been in an industry for more than 21 years now, and CRTC supported APTN's creation because CRTC had the power and the tools to make available, to give a license to APTN and make it available, right? Because we're mandatory carriage. So we're very lucky for that. And if it wasn't for the CRTC, Indigenous people would still be invisible in the broadcasting industry. So what's going to happen to us and other independent, smaller broadcasters if there's no regulation, if there's no oversight from the CRTC? Right now, the CRTC can, because the Broadcast Act is technologically neutral. But if this change happens, well, we feel that there's no future for us in the online world, that people will be, the big distributors will be deciding what to carry, when to carry, and would they want to carry smaller independent broadcasters such as APTN? Do they find the value in us? APTN is more than just a broadcaster. We service an underrepresented population. We help to preserve and promote our languages, our cultures, our traditions, our history. And it just makes us strong. And I think in a society, diversity enriches. I'm not only talking about Indigenous right now, I'm talking about all diversity, all that we bring together. It's a question of our identity, our cultural identity. So CRTC definitely should have the power to be sure that this is preserved and promoted.
Yeah, thank you. It always struck me as ironic back in 1999 when APTN applied for the first license that we had English services, French services, and various ethnic languages, and was really the first peoples were the last peoples to get on air. So I think the issues you raised are continuing irony, but timely as well. So thank you. Howard, I'd like to ask your thoughts about what you'd like to see changed in the bill.
Well, I have to agree with Monica that there's a humongous hole in the bill, but I thought she was going to mention the one that we were thinking of. So there's more than one. And you know, I would characterize what Monica's referring to, what I'm about to talk about, as a drafting error that I'm hoping as a drafting error, a legislative drafting error, and hoping that the committee is able to fix it as being within the scope of the bill. I thought that, you know, what we would be talking about, well, what Unifor would be advocating the most strongly for in this bill would be a dedicated stream of funding for local news, and we do. But we find ourselves having to, in fact, point out a drafting error, and that is the complete repeal of the Canadian ownership provisions in the Act in Section 3. And not a partial repeal in order to acknowledge that the foreign-based streamers are going to have to be part of the system now, and therefore you would, you know, presumably tweak the Canadian ownership provisions of the bill. But it's instead what we're looking at is a complete outright repeal, and that just seems like an error. And I can't believe that was the intention of parliamentarians in the second reading of the bill. I mean, you just think about the logical consequence of repealing that. And that simply opens up to the situation. And it's not I'm not fear-mongering here. This is a plausible scenario in which, you know, Rupert Murdoch decides he wants to buy Global News. You know, Corus has been looking for a foreign partner or for a partner, and they've indicated an interest in being able to accept a foreign-based partner. Can we imagine turning Global News into Fox News North? It could happen, especially if Section 3 remains the way it is. The response we got from Mr. Ripley from Heritage was, "Don't worry, the 1997 cabinet order covers Canadian ownership," and we've suggested that's not true, or at the very least it's contestable, perhaps in court. That, you know, a cabinet directive which talks about Canadian ownership in the absence of a provision in the Act which guarantees it may not be worth the paper it's written on. So that, in our view, is, you know, to use Monica's term, is a humongous hole in the bill.
Okay, thanks. And just to get detailed about it, a cabinet order in law doesn't have the same weight as a legal issue in a bill, right? In an act.
Well, I'm not Peter Grant, although the well-known broadcasting lawyer from Toronto, but you know, I'd love to hear from somebody with that kind of expertise about whether we can be as sanguine about the situation as Mr. Ripley was.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly more changeable, a cabinet order.
Well, first of all, a future cabinet could just repeal it, right? That's the first point. But also, if I was a foreign broadcaster trying to buy into the Canadian system and take over a Canadian media company, that'd be the first thing I'd point out.
Yeah. Madeline, what are your thoughts about what needs to change in the bill?
Well, I think, you know, when we take a look and remember the Charter of Rights, Section 27, that calls for the rights to be interpreted in a manner consistent with preservation and enhancement of the multicultural heritage of Canadians. I think what we'd like the coalition, the Canadian Media Coalition, would like to have changed is to ensure full participation in the broadcasting system on an equal footing with Anglo, Franco, Indigenous communities, not only as audiences, but as employees, as producers and operators of services. So what we'd like to, we have proposed a new section, and that simply is a small amendment, big amendment though for the people of Canada with diverse backgrounds, and that is to provide opportunities to Canadians from racialized communities and of diverse ethnocultural backgrounds to produce programming in diverse languages, as well as in English and French, or in any combination of them, and to carry on broadcasting undertakings. And certainly, this is why I'd like to reiterate that the system is archaic. It's not supportive of diverse producers, independent producers in the various multilingual languages in Canada. And also, another proposed amendment we would like to the existing section is a range of broadcasting services in English and in diverse languages and in French that can be progressively extended to all Canadians. So it is time for change. The name of this conference is, the future path. Future path in Canada is in immigration, is multilingual communities, and it's certainly important in building a just society. And certainly when you have information, and we have this experience with COVID, where our communities needed needed information in a trusted language other than English and French. And this is where it's important. You're contributing to healthy Canadian citizenry. And certainly when you take a look at what's happened in the past with the racial intent, you can switch out any community. Right now it's Asians, tomorrow it could be Indigenous communities, South Asian. It's very important to have equal footing. And the system has to be supportive of multilingual audiences, multilingual producers, and multilingual talent. So this is what we'd like to share with the audiences today. And this is nothing new. Ethnic media has existed in Canada since the 1800s, and always a need to communicate in one's language of comfort. So we look forward to the system supportive of this kind of communication, where immigration is in the millions coming forward in the next 3 years.
Yeah, certainly the COVID example you give is very illustrative, because you think about the enormous amount of information we get in English and French broadcasting on radio and television. People who don't speak English or French are not getting a fraction of that information, and the whole world of COVID is just changing so fast all the time. How do you get all that information to everybody?
And it's a trust factor to have information in your language of comfort, and also editorial perspective that will contribute to that kind of comprehension. So I see this as an opportunity to bring to actually build a stronger citizenry, and being able to have a system that is supportive of the many ethnocultural communities and all communities in Canada. So it's a great opportunity, and that is the path going forward. That is the future.
Yeah, thank you. Alain, your thoughts about what you'd like to see changed in the bill?
I know that Howard quickly mentioned the issue of local news, and for us, the issue of local news is really important, because it really is it's a priority in terms of programming for Canadians. I know many people talk about Canadian programming, and when there are, I guess there's a generalization about Canadian programming, and saying that the comparison of Canadian programming to programming from around the world, from the United States, etc. But the reality is, millions of Canadians watch Canadian programming each and every single day. And the key element in that is local news programming. And when I say local news, it's not just the news in the local community. It's the news that's by and large produced by a number of local TV stations and local radio stations. And they try and meet the needs of that community. And there are, from that, you have regional context and regional news, and certainly national news organizations and national news programs. And it's a real key priority for Canadians. And the reality is that the model for local TV stations and local radio stations, frankly, who produce that kind of very important news and community context, is currently and has been entirely dependent on advertising. Now, that has been a model that has worked for a long period of time, but now it's not just in structural decline. It is in foundational support issues. And the reality is, when we look at that, and you look at an issue like COVID, what COVID did to specifically the media industry is kind of push things forward. It kind of, what the trending and the issues that were happening, they came more to the forefront. And the forefront for us, and I think for a lot of local stations and news organizations across Canada, is that the news was primordial. It was very important. People wanted to have that community information. And you may not watch your newscast every day. You may not listen to your radio station every day for news, but when you do, you expect it to be there, and you expect it to be topical and reflective of what's going on. So at the same time as the importance of local news emerged, you really had a really difficult advertising market. And in a recovery, having to go back and convince, advertisers to come back and say, come back in advertising for radio and television can be more difficult, because it is a change. Change has occurred in, there's a valley, if you will, of time. So for us, there needs to be, other systems in the broadcasting space and various, including online, have access to alternative sources of revenue, and specifically subscriptions. And it's a great way, and it is the new way, and it is increasingly, potentially even for some undertakings, the only way to sustain their operations. That is not the case for radio and TV stations. So there's a fundamental issue. So our position in C10 that priority needs to be addressed and specifically included as an amendment, so that the CRTC, in its evaluation of the regulatory system, can look at the importance of local news, for all Canadians.
So Alain, can I just ask you one more question on that? In terms of local news, what would you want the bill to be saying, and how do you think the CRTC can encourage more local broadcasting? What's the amendment you're looking for?
The amendment we've proposed is to have a specific recognition that the broadcasting system. So it's a general amendment, if you will, that highlights the importance of local news and local news media in Canada. The mechanism to which how it would be implemented and reviewed would be by the CRTC. We have suggested there could be funding mechanisms, and the funding mechanisms they're not different, they're not new. There are existing mechanisms in the Canadian broadcasting system. For example, it can be, the Canadian Media Fund supports a number of different programming initiatives and programming priorities in what is considered underrepresented categories of programming. So whether it is existing contributions that are made to existing funds, and or new contributions by online undertakings, or even the creation of new funds, the mechanism is there, but really the key is that the funding is important, because it's no longer a mid or long-term issue. It's a short-term issue, that there needs to be contributions and funding and resources available to local news media in Canada.
Okay, are you saying for the large broadcasters like your company, there isn't enough incentive in your current system to be doing more local broadcasting? There isn't enough financial incentive?
The financial result, I mean, we're all consumers of media, so we know what has been happening, and we know how we watch TV or listen to the radio. It's not that we don't watch CTV or Global or Nouveau or TVA. We do. It's just that we do watch other channels and other services as well. So the reality is those other services are usually subscription services. So they have the revenue sources and the sustainability. Local TV stations have been losing money for a better part of 5, 6, 7, 8 years. It's only a question of which stations are losing and some are not. So it's not sustainable. And so the issue needs to be addressed so that going forward there is a sustainable model for local television for these stations and TV and radio across Canada.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned radio, because we haven't talked a lot about radio. Kevin, can I ask you your thoughts on what you'd like to see changed in the bill? And you need to unmute. Now that makes a complete webinar when you get to ask somebody to unmute, so thank you.
Great. Happy to oblige. What I would certainly echo part of what Howard and Alain said. Definitely, I think the recognition of the importance of news as part of this bill. You know, I'd been away from the broadcasting sector for 13 years, and when I came back, and we were still using this phrase of telling Canadian stories, and telling Canadian stories oftentimes doesn't include the news, which is the essential Canadian story that most Canadians are the most interested in. It's what they tune into, and you know, we know that that where they turn for that is to their local broadcasters, both TV and radio. And you know, I think as Madeline brought out this idea that within the context of having this global pandemic, that you have communities, and whether if they are cultural communities or even just the broader community that is being impacted by this global pandemic in very sort of localized ways. And I think, you know, definitely into those smaller communities within the communities, and to be able to have those local radio broadcasters, I know certainly for sure, were able to convey what was happening on the ground in their community, not just, you know, the sort of the broad provincial level, national level, international level, but what's happening in people's own backyards and what the new restrictions mean for people there. So, you know, I think an acknowledgement of the news within the bill is something it's quite critical. You know, as just a general observation, this is a project to amend the Broadcasting Act, and there are a lot of days where I really find that broadcasters are kind of treated as incidental in this process. You know, that there's a lot of folks who are coming in and have over the years benefited tremendously from the obligations that have been placed on broadcasters. Now that we have a situation where broadcasters continue to have the same obligations and have incredible pressures on their advertising dollars that help to support what it has been that they've been doing for years, the crunch on that inevitably comes with the internal production, which is oftentimes news, information, sports. And I think for us, there's a level of frustration with that. There are some places in the bill where I think we're just a little bit cautious about the fact that it does create, you know, the goal of the bill is to create some level of equity or a level playing field or whatever sort of terminology you want to use between the international players and our domestic players. But I think it's creating two parallel systems, and we do just have to be really mindful of not creating something that's going to continue to benefit the incredibly well-financed global players over our own, because, you know, and just bringing it back to news, we know that that Netflix and Amazon aren't going to be doing the local news from, you know, from St. John's or Saskatoon or Quebec City.
Nor do we want them to.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Now let me ask you. It's a huge question, but I'm going to do it in a quick round if you don't mind. Over many years, people have said we should stop regulating, and I had the good fortune of being on the commission back at the turn of the century. And when I started there in the previous century, people said, you won't even serve out your term, the commission's going to be closed down. Well, 20 years is still there. My quick question is, given technology, given the online world, why do we still need to be regulating? So sort of in a minute or so, if each of you can give me an answer, what's the most important point? And I'll start with you this time, Kevin. What's the most important thing we need a regulator for at this time and for the next decade?
Yeah, I'm, honestly, in terms of what the benefit of regulation is, it's hard within this current context for us. I think, I think that we would like to see regulation evolve, and there are aspects of it right now that are really sort of based in antiquated notions, and so can a regulated broadcast space work at a time when there's large unregulated areas? I mean, to preserve some aspect of Canadian cultural sovereignty, absolutely, but that has to be really balanced out against the sorts of reporting obligations, exhibition obligations, all those sorts of obligations that are placed on our broadcasters that just aren't in the multitude of other ways that people can receive content.
Okay, Howard, your quick answer about why we need regulation at this time.
Well, we've been answering that question for the last 50 years, and it's been in response to a different technology every time. We need regulation in order to protect our culture from being, leveled by the Leviathan to the south. And that's not to say that we don't like the Leviathan to the south. They give us a lot of good cultural products, but the question is whether or not they're going to completely overwhelm Canadian culture. And for us to be defeatist in the face of new technology is just not very enlightened public policy.
Okay, were you going to show us your T-shirt, by the way?
Oh, yes.
You can read it out. It says, "I am Canadian content." Yes. Well, Howard showed that to us before we started, and I thought it was we get a quick look at that. Madeline, your thought about why we need Canadian regulation?
Regulation. Well, I think regulation could be a very positive thing in certainly evolving and developing, equity for the citizens of Canada, for the audiences, and for participants in media. But it should also be moving forward. For example, the ethnic policy review hasn't happened for many, many years, and the texture and fabric of Canada has certainly evolved and will continue to evolve. So I think this is a good opportunity to really, make us better Canadians. Regulation should be positive, should be moving forward, and really making the best of, all of the broadcasters who are competing. If there wasn't regulation, the success story of APTN wouldn't be there. If there wasn't regulation, you wouldn't have, multilingual radio and television over the airwaves. But it has to be, much more enhanced. It has to be something that is modernized, and certainly in this digital era, it really, in an environment where you're seeing racism escalate, you're seeing white supremacy escalate in different parts of Canada. This should be a tool that makes us better citizens. And I think that's what regulation and policy should be all about, something positive and something that really harnesses the will and the justice in this country to make us all better Canadians. I know you think I should start singing "O Canada" now, but you really feel like it should be a positive thing and not something that is, is not squelching the creative talents and opening up opportunities for all.
Yeah, Alain, your thought about why we need regulation going forward?
I think there's been many benefits of regulation. I mean, while we look at these issues now and see them as different, you could look back to someone mentioned Peter Grant. You could look back to in various books and things, and the origins of the CBC, and discuss the fights of cable in the 80s and the retransmission of services into Canada, et cetera. There's a lot of a history of regulation. These issues are not new. Maybe the technological platform is new, but those issues, they're kind of the same issues that were addressed over time. The key is, I think, as Kevin mentioned, is to have that balance. Broadcasters, take for example a station like CTV, has to do programming in local news, has to do programs of national interest like dramas, documentaries, and others. It also has to contribute to a music video production fund. So there are many things that we have to do. And I think now the flexibility needs to be put in place so we can target, frankly, what we do best. So going forward, we can be perhaps a different contributor, perhaps more of a niche contributor, but contributor based on what we can, what is our, our greatest sort of advantage and opportunity in Canadian programming.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, and Scott Sims, I'll ask you the first question because you're probably best equipped to address this. How does Bill C-10 address the future role of the national broadcasting, the CBC Radio-Canada?
Yeah, it affects it in certain ways, not fundamentally, of course. There are certain ways in which it brings it into the modern regime, but I think in the future you're going to see probably more regulation, probably dealing with the CBC in particular. They weren't even witnesses to the first round. They may turn out to be witnesses in when it comes to the Senate. But it is, the thing about it is that, if I may just talk about Canadian CBC in general, and that is that as it finds its way towards what it wants to be over the next little while, because if you look at all this, the way it's going to affect it, of course, when the online streaming, so on and so forth, the CBC has gone ahead with products like GEM and others. I think it's very important that we support Canadian content and ways of doing it through CBC. A prime example would be Schitt's Creek. Nobody wanted it until they picked it up. And if content is king, as they like to say, then Schitt's Creek wears the crown. So it is a fine example. It is not directly affected. It is on the margins of this bill. It wasn't in the line of sight, I guess you could say. But nevertheless, it's a very important part of it. I perhaps there'll be witnesses during the Senate hearings. I'm not really sure, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I just have to, since you just answered that question about a great product like Schitt's Creek, I just have to add, come from away, Scott. You represent the city of Gander in your riding, and that was the home of Come From Away. I was lucky enough to be driving across Newfoundland a couple of years ago and stopped at the airport there. Tell us a little bit about what that means to Gander people there in terms of what local, that's a different kind of local programming, but why that's important to you.
It's vital because it gives us a stage. If I can just tie into what was talked about before, why do we need regulation? I think Gander's a perfect example. We had a major investment from Netflix regarding a show called Frontier. And the reason why we were able to do that and many other productions is because we have the facilities and we have the talent to do it. So without the regulation, then it's going to be hard for us to maintain these industries by which that we can be involved. So to step up our game, this is why we do this. Look, it's under normal circumstances, when you talk about fisheries or agriculture and trade deals, there's always they're striving for that level playing field. So there's less regulations. But when it comes to broadcasting, this is culture, and you draw a line in the sand. I hear a story. I don't know if this is true or not. Someone can verify this, but during the war, when they asked Winston Churchill about cutting departments, you got to cut this from this department, and they asked him, Prime Minister, what do you want to cut from culture? And he said, nothing. I mean, what the hell are we fighting for anyway? And quite frankly, that's how we have to review this. I remember way back when, I'm a little off topic, but way back when, rumors about the Competition Bureau replacing the CRTC. I haven't heard it since, only because now we realize, I think, the value of which these regulations bring to our industry. And to go back to your point, places like Gander or places like Medicine Hat, because there are places where you find a really good industry for filmmaking and content, they won't survive without it.
Yeah. Howard, do your members work for CBC at all? Is there a connection?
No, they're represented by the Canadian Media Guild, and so I make it a practice to defer to them when we're discussing CBC.
Okay. Monica, a quick question to you about CBC. They do a fair amount of Indigenous programming. Does that help you? Does that help the whole world of Indigenous programming? Sorry, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, you froze for a second, so I missed that question. And there's a lot of background sound.
Okay, if everyone could please mute themselves, there's a bit of background. So my question, can you hear me okay now, Monica?
Yes, thank you.
Let's keep going. Okay. Well, you froze for a second too, so let's give this a shot. Your thoughts about Indigenous programming and the role of the CBC. How does it help you and help Indigenous programming overall?
Oh, definitely. I think in CBC, as the public broadcaster, has a duty to reflect Indigenous stories, reflect Indigenous content, but the difference is that they're not an Indigenous broadcaster. So they reflect, but Indigenous-owned media, we're an identity of our expression, right? An expression of our identity, I mean. So there's a big difference. So we should work towards, bringing those stories up front. And, CBC does have a big reach, even though APTN is available everywhere across Canada. People still feel that APTN, Aboriginal, that's not for me, not interested. However, good content is good content. A good story is a good story. Going back to content is king. So we know that we had shows with CBC, Radio Canada, and when they broadcast them, the ratings are pretty good. We never get those ratings, unfortunately, but it just shows that Indigenous stories resonate with many people. Going back to your question about regulation, I just want to add that regulation is important to protect key services and to show that there are different broadcasters, the smaller one, we complement one another with the big ones, right? And that's how we need to see things, and that's how we have to move towards, is being there for one another and help the producers, help the storytellers. That's what it's all about, is putting our stories out there, sharing the stories we want to share. And for Indigenous people, media is key to our survival, because now we hope that people, are listening to us, to what we have to say, instead of hearing about us by others.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, what I'm going to do is just ask everybody for a 30-second, literally a 30-second comment, and then we'll end with Scott Sims to update us on what's happening with the bill. So Madeline, in 30 seconds, what's your last thought you want to leave us with?
Well, language is culture, and I think it's part of positive self-esteem and identity. And therefore, it's important to be able to have a full and equitable system, the Broadcasting Act, that'll hopefully help all of the diverse communities, the audiences and producers and talent in Canada. And I should also say that it's time for a radical change. And I know institutions don't always like radical change, but certainly we've been behind, and it's time to really move forward and really have an equitable playing field for diverse communities in Canada. And we even thought at one point, is it time for a multilingual CBC? If you're looking at the population and the fact that so many languages are spoken in Canada, having a station that merely broadcasts in 20 languages, is that enough when we know there's over 180 languages being spoken? So
okay.
So yes, and I get excited about.
Certainly an idea that's been around before. So yeah. Okay, yeah. So sorry to move along. Howard, 30 seconds.
Well, I guess I would say this. This is a minority parliament, and Mr. Sims has been navigating this bill through his committee very effectively, and the MPs there, by and large, have taken it very seriously. There's been very little partisanship, and I'm hoping, the minister has said he's doing these issues bit by bit, bite by bite, because it's a minority parliament, and this is the first big bite. And I'm hoping that the committee, Parliament, and the Senate will get it done.
Great, thank you. Alain, 30 seconds.
We put my timer on. I think the medium is the message, and the medium now is the distribution from the internet. Has expanded and provided new distribution, but regulation, especially in Canada, is dealing with the issue of distribution since it started. So it's an adaptation and a new change to what regulation can and should be in Canada, which should then be reflected in what the contributions are made by Canadian broadcasters going forward.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think that that it's really essential that, especially as we move through the amendments phase and through the following phases, that that broadcasters aren't incidental to this process. That and to the chair's point, the broadcasters over the years have been the foundation of a lot of the Canadian content that gets developed and helping to make sure that there are productions and those production jobs. We shouldn't be there just to help build up a production community so that the streamers can come in and make use of it when it's their time to. The Broadcasting Act really has to be oriented towards making sure that we have a strong broadcasting sector. And so, again, there are lots of noble ends in terms of what it is that the Broadcasting Act can help to engender. But if it doesn't engender a strong broadcasting sector, then all of the rest is going to eventually fall by the wayside.
Okay, thanks very much. Monica.
Well, if we can correct the CRTC's authority to regulate and supervise the online distribution, it would be way better, because we're definitely concerned that the CRTC will be left without the tools it would need in the future to ensure the broadcasting policy objectives. And especially that's a big concern to smaller independent broadcasters and services such as APTN.
Okay, thank you so much. Scott, if you can close us off and give us a sense of what's happening with the bill in the next little while.
Oh, I get to do the dismount, so hopefully I hit the landing, but I'll try. Just a very quick story. A dear friend of mine passed away a few years ago, but he was a good friend of mine in Ottawa. His name is Charles King. He's a former lobbyist and became an executive with Shaw Communications. Back in 2010 or 11, he came to me about an issue where there were traditional broadcasters were paying in to the system, primarily Canada Media Fund, but the over-the-top people, the streamers, did not. And I said to him, I said, yeah, we should talk about this and maybe we'll come up with a solution. He said, no, you don't understand. This is a thing, and it's going to be a bigger thing down the road. Now, I don't know, I miss him dearly, but if he was here today, I don't know if he would like C10 or not. I assume he would, but one thing he would say is it's about time, first and foremost. So right now we find ourselves in the middle. We have, let's just say our legislative experts are very busy this week with all the amendments. And from here, we're probably, if successful, we'll go to the Senate. It has been, for the most part, somewhat nonpartisan. There have been great discussions, but those great discussions by MPs were followed by or inspired by great panelists such as yourself, great witnesses through this time. So I want to thank the panelists and all the witnesses who contributed, and there's still quite a bit of work to do, even though some may say it's a first step, but hopefully we're on our way. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Pearson Center.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'll just make a quick note to the audience, tell them about our next series in this conference. We're back on Thursday. We'll have a discussion on transport policy with Transport Minister Omar Al-Gabra. We'll be talking economic rebuilding with Perrin Beatty of the Chamber of Commerce and Jerry Dias from Unifor. And then we've got an all-party panel which will be discussing the year ahead, Parlement en 2021, a session in French with MPs Greg Fergus, Alexandre Boleris, Monique Posé, Senator Julie Méville-Deschênes, and Marc-André Leclerc. So that's our lineup for this week, and there's more next week. Please join us. I want to thank all of you. Scott Sims, thank you very much. Monica Ile, Howard Law, Kevin Desjardins, Alan Stratty, and Madeleine Ziniak. Thank you for your time. This is really, 30 years it's taken us to get here. You're all dealing with something very important. Best of luck to you, and Scott, to you and your committee, Godspeed, and do us the right thing. But with that, I know that we're not able to hear the audience applauding for you. So what I'll ask you to do instead as we close out is to applaud each other and thank you for your excellent performance today. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.